Shane Arden.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like previous speakers, I'm very pleased also to be part of supporting the Environmental Protection Liability Annex Amendment Bill for the Antarctic. It's been interesting listening to the various speeches, particularly the Minister's opening comments, but it's also been particularly concerning and interesting to listen to our opponents and their contribution and their various references to New Zealand's lack of focus, or the New Zealand government's lack of focus in environmental issues. Mr. Speaker, I guess it's one of those examples of where sometimes actions speak louder than words. And in the previous 9 years of the Labor government, we had a woeful period of environmental legislative protection. We, in fact, languished. And it is the two fables, I guess, that come to mind is the emperor has no clothes. They talk all the time, but they actually did nothing. And to suggest that in some way New Zealand is now turning its back on the environment is about as shallow and as short-sighted as it's possible to be. So the reference by particularly the former Trade Minister and Foreign Affairs Minister to the Doha round, I look upon the Doha round currently taking place with the same kind of similarity to a bunch of drunks going off to another booze-up to talk about the effects of alcoholism. That's how I would look at some of that activity. I wonder how they get there. Do they go by sailboat? Do they ride their bikes? Or do they fly in jet planes? I wonder how they get there. So the only thing that New Zealand has done in recent times in terms of changes in direction is to remove agricultural emissions from the ETS. Now, Mr. Speaker, how by taxing methane emissions from animals were we going to reduce our environmental impact? That's the question, Antarctica. And no one has been able to answer that. So, Mr. Speaker, talking about the passing of this bill, I've heard a wide-ranging debate, Mr. Speaker, and I thought that must be licence for it. As one of my colleagues said, New Zealand is one of the 12 original signatories to the Antarctic Treaty, which was signed on 1 December 1959 in Washington, D.C., Mr. Speaker, which we have then since had many other involvements in. And this is yet just another example of that. I suggest to our opponents over there, given that they were involved in the original negotiations, in fact, the minister that was involved is present in the House, former minister, it is, in fact, quite unusual that we would be here today after all this time debating this bill, given the time that they had to further this important piece of legislation. And I'm sure it would have been passed prior to now if it had not been, of course, Mr. Speaker, for the fact that they have spent so much time filibustering on all sorts of nonsense which needed no extra time spent on it up until this point in time. It is one of those rare occasions, of course, where the Parliament is unanimous, and it is a privilege to be part of it when it is unanimous on something as important as this particular legislation. So I look forward, Mr. Speaker, to its passage through the Parliament.
Called Charles Cheval.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Antarctic Treaty came into force on the 23rd of June 1961, and as Phil Goff explained to the House, it was a unique piece of international law at the time, and it remains unique in the sense that it suspended claims to sovereignty to a large part of the Earth's land surface. It committed the Antarctic region to demilitarisation and to peace. And there have been numerous subsequent agreements to which New Zealand has been a party, which have furthered the aims and the scheme of the original treaty. And one of the most significant of those relates to environmental protection. Sir, the Protocol on Environmental Protection to the Antarctic Treaty was signed back in 1991, in October 1991. It entered into force because it got sufficient member state signatories on the 14th of January 1998. And it's one of the most significant international environment agreements that has ever been concluded. It prevents development It provides for the protection of the Antarctic environment through 5 specific annexes. They relate to marine protection, flora and fauna, environmental impact assessments, waste management and protected areas. And it prohibits all activities relating to mineral resources except for scientific investigation. Now, where this annex fits is it is the 6th annex to that particular agreement. And it relates, as previous speakers have said, to liability arising from environmental emergencies. It was adopted back in 2005, but it's yet to come into force because not enough nations have yet passed the necessary domestic legislation to allow for ratification. Now, Sir Dennis O'Rourke, I think, commented on some of the provisions of the legislation that will be necessary to bring this particular annex into force in respect of New Zealand law. And the reason that it's unique is that when we ratify a treaty, in most cases, there's an international legal enforcement mechanism. But Antarctica doesn't have those. Antarctica has no permanent population. It has no enforcement system in its treaties, and particularly when it comes to environmental protection, the states parties have to enact domestic legislation that provides for their courts to provide for enforcement because there is no international machinery, and that's why this particular protocol is so significant and why I certainly welcome, along with my colleagues, the passage finally of this legislation through the House. I'm certainly very glad that we're getting on to implementing the Liability Annex, but as Phil Goff pointed out, 3 years on the order paper is too long. It is a symbol, I think, of the casual way with which we are treating a very, very important environmental matter. And Sir, as Grant Robertson said, that's at one with the way in which we've seen our treaty obligations under the Kyoto Protocol and the second commitment period treated by this government along with domestic legislation on that matter. Just as we've seen the Prime Minister admit that the 100% pure brand is simply a marketing exercise as far as he's concerned. Well, Sir, I was interested to hear Shane Ardern try to rebut our concerns about the laxness of the environmental record of this government. He claimed that there'd been 9 years of inaction when we were in office. Well, nothing, Sir, could be further from the truth. Perhaps he could explain, perhaps he or one of his colleagues who's about to rise and get to their feet could explain why in 2008 New Zealand stood, as a result of the record of the Helen Clark-led Labour government, at number 1 in the Yale environmental standards, the rankings that are independently put together by a leading United States university. And in the 4 short years of this government, we have fallen to number 14 in that ranking system, and it looks like we will fall further. So that is the independent evidence about this government's stewardship of the environment and of conservation matters. Those members should hang their heads in shame. And while I welcome, as I said, the final passage of this legislation, it has taken too long. And if this attitude to the environment continues on the part of that government, it will be a deservedly short-lived one, Sir.
Dr. Cam Calder.